Here is something nobody tells you when you first start taking poker seriously. The river does not determine your results. The turn does not determine your results. The flop does. The flop is where the entire shape of a hand gets decided, where fortunes get committed and then lost, where the pros quietly take control while everyone else is still staring at their hole cards trying to figure out if they are ahead. And here is the painful truth. Most players, including players who have been sitting at tables for years, approach the flop the same way every single time. They look at their 2 cards, they look at the 3 community cards, they decide if they hit or they missed, and they act from that binary, that simple yes or no, that complete misunderstanding of what is actually happening in the hand. That is not poker. That is a coin flip dressed up in chips and felt. The professionals who dominate at the highest levels of this game, at the World Series of Poker, at the super high roller bowls, in the nosebleed cash games where a single pot can exceed what most people earn in a year, they do not look at the flop and ask, did I hit? They look at the flop and ask, what does this board do to both ranges? What story does this texture tell? What pressure can I create here? And what information is my opponent's action already giving me before they say a word? That single shift in perspective, from hand-based thinking to range-based thinking, from did I hit to what does this board mean for both of us, is the single most important transformation a developing poker player can make. It is the difference between a player who wins sometimes and a player who wins consistently, between a player who runs good and a player who runs a system. This video is going to give you that system. 11 sections covering every dimension of advanced flop play, from board texture to c-bet frequencies, from check strategies to hand reading, from GTO foundations to the exploitative adjustments that extract maximum value against real opponents in real games. By the time this is over, you will never look at a flop the same way again. Not because you learned a trick, because you changed the question you ask when those 3 cards hit the felt. The decision to play flops systematically rather than instinctively is the decision that separates players who plateau at a certain level from players who keep growing. Every session you play from this moment forward is an opportunity to apply what you just learned and to see flops through the eyes of a player who understands what is actually happening when those 3 cards hit the table. The flop is not where the hand begins. It is where the amateur ends and the professional begins. Range versus range thinking is the foundation of everything advanced in flop play, and if you do not understand it, you are essentially playing one-dimensional poker in a 3-dimensional game. Let us build this from scratch so it is completely clear. Before any flop is dealt, both players in a hand already have a range. A range is the complete collection of hands they could reasonably be holding based on every action that occurred before the flop. If a player raised from under the gun at a 9-handed table, their range is weighted toward premium hands, pairs, strong Broadway cards, big aces. They are not raising 7-2 offsuit from under the gun at a serious table. If a player called from the big blind after a cutoff raise, their range is much wider. Suited connectors, small pairs, medium aces, a wide variety of Broadway combinations, hands that have value as callers, but not as raisers in that specific position. Now the flop comes. And here is the critical insight that separates beginners from advanced players. The 3 community cards do not just interact with your specific 2-hole cards. They interact with both ranges simultaneously. Some flops heavily favor the pre-flop raiser's range. Some heavily favor the caller's range. Some are relatively neutral. And the entire question of who should be betting, how often, how large, and with what types of hands is determined not by what you specifically hold, but by how this specific board texture interacts with both complete ranges. Picture this scenario. A player raises from the cutoff. Another player calls from the big blind. The flop comes ace-king-queen with 1 suit. This board is devastating for the big blind caller's range and extremely favorable for the cutoff raiser's range. Why? Because ace-king-queen heavily rewards the types of hands a cutoff raiser plays. Ace-king, ace-queen, king-queen, pocket aces, pocket kings, pocket queens. All these hands are far more likely to exist in a raising range than in a big blind calling range. The cutoff has range advantage on this board. They should be betting frequently with a wide variety of hands because the board supports the story their range tells. The big blind, by contrast, is at a structural disadvantage. Their strongest hands on this board are fewer. Their medium strength hands are more vulnerable and their bluffing options are more limited. Understanding this dynamic before you look at your specific two cards is what range versus range thinking actually means in practice. Poker is not a card game played by people. It is a people game that uses cards. Your opponent's range is the opponent. The cards are just evidence. Board texture is the vocabulary of flop strategy, and fluency in that vocabulary is what separates players who make vague, instinctive decisions from players who make precise, strategic ones. Every flop that hits the table belongs somewhere on a spectrum from completely dry to extremely wet, and each point on that spectrum creates a different set of strategic implications for both the player in position and the player out of position. A dry board is characterized by low connectivity and low flush draw potential. Ace 7-2 with 3 different suits is the classic dry board. There are very few straight draws possible, no flush draws, and the only real draws are 2 card combinations that need significant help. On a board like this, the player with range advantage, typically the pre-flop raiser in most common spots, can bet with high frequency because draws are rare, made hands are infrequent, and the board rewards the kind of premium hand strength that a raising range contains more of. A wet board is the opposite. 9-8 of clubs with 7 of hearts is a board where the world is connected. 2 clubs for a flush draw. 10-6 makes the straight. Jack-10 makes the straight. 7-5 makes the straight. Pairs of every denomination live on this board. This board rewards calling ranges far more than raising ranges because the hands that thrive here, suited connectors, small pairs, medium-suited hands, are far more prevalent in the ranges of players who called rather than raised before the flop. Between these two extremes lies every possible texture you will encounter in real games, and learning to read texture instantly, to understand within seconds of the flop being dealt what this board does to both ranges, is one of the highest return skills you can develop as a poker player. Here is the practical application. When you see a dry, disconnected board that favors your range as the pre-flop raiser, bet frequently, bet across many of your hands, and use the board's favorability to create pressure. When you see a wet, connected board that does not clearly favor either range, slow down, think carefully about which specific hands benefit from aggression, and recognize that checking can be as powerful as betting in the right spots on these textures. Texture fluency is a skill you build by deliberately asking the range question every single time you see a new flop, regardless of whether you are in the hand. Watch the board, ask who it favors. This practice, done consistently, builds the instant pattern recognition that professionals use to make decisions in seconds that take other players minutes. The board is not neutral. Every flop sends a message about who it belongs to. The pro reads that message before acting. The amateur acts before reading it. Continuation betting, the art of betting the flop after you raised pre-flop, is perhaps the most discussed concept in poker education, and simultaneously one of the most consistently misapplied. The reason is simple. Most players learned a simple rule and applied it universally. The rule they learned was bet the flop when you raise pre-flop. And for years that rule made money because most opponents were passive, most tables were full of players who folded too much, and the C-bet worked as a brute force profit generator, even when it was strategically unjustified. That era is over at any serious level of play. Modern opponents adjust. They call C-bets at appropriate frequencies. They raise them when the board texture favors their range. They float them with plans to take the pot on the turn. And the player who C-bets mechanically into every board regardless of texture, position, or range interaction is now the player getting exploited rather than the one doing the exploiting. Let us replace the simple rule with a system. The first question to ask before any C-bet is not should I bet, but rather what does betting accomplish here given both ranges and this specific texture. On boards where your range has clear structural advantage, betting accomplishes 2 things simultaneously. It builds value from your strong hands, and it creates profitable folds from your opponent's hands that have no strong claim to the board. This is when C-betting is clearly correct. On boards where your opponent's range is actually better suited to the texture, betting accomplishes something far less appealing. It charges your opponent to continue with hands that have you beat while potentially losing a double bet to their stronger range. This is when checking is often the higher expected value decision. Here is a real scenario. You raise from early position with pocket kings. The flop comes Jack-10-9 with 2 spades. This board is terrible for your range, not because kings are bad, but because Jack 10-9 heavily rewards the kinds of connected suited hands that live in calling ranges. Your opponent's range contains many straights, many two pairs, many strong draws. Your pocket kings, while still a strong hand, exist on a board where your range's overall advantage is minimal. Blindly c-betting this board, as if it were ace-7 deuce rainbow, is one of the most common expensive mistakes in mid-level poker. The c-bet decision is the most repeated flop decision you will ever make, which means improving it delivers compounding benefits across every session. Even small improvements in c-bet frequency and selection, applied consistently over hundreds of hours, generate significant and measurable results. Knowing when not to bet is a skill most players never develop. The check is not a surrender. The check is a weapon in the hands of a player who understands timing. Position is not just an advantage in poker. On the flop, position is a complete restructuring of the strategic landscape that fundamentally changes what moves are available, what information you receive, and what expected value every single action generates. Understanding positional advantage on the flop at a deep level is one of the clearest markers that separates recreational players from serious ones. When you are in position on the flop, meaning you act after your opponent on every street, you have something that cannot be bought, cannot be bluffed, and cannot be taken away. You have information. Every single action your opponent takes before you have to decide gives you data. When they bet, you learn something about their range. When they check, you learn something different. When they bet a specific size, that sizing tells its own story. You collect all of this information before committing a single chip, and then you make your decision with more context than the person who acted first. This advantage compounds across all three streets. Out of position players face what professionals call a multi-street guessing problem. They must decide how to play their hand, knowing that their opponent, who acts second on every street, has the structural advantage of responding to information rather than generating it. The numbers bear this out dramatically. When you track win rates by position in no-limit hold'em, the difference between playing from the button and playing from the blinds is enormous even when holding the exact same hands. The same hand that generates profit from the button generates a loss from the big blind at virtually every stake level. This means that when you are out of position on the flop, you need to adjust your strategy significantly. You cannot play a wide, aggressive range from out of position the same way you would from in position. The strategic cost is too high. Out of position, your betting range should be more polarized. Either hands strong enough to bet for value and protection, or hands strong enough conceptually to represent as bluffs with specific equity. The middle of your range, the medium-strength hands that are too strong to bluff and too weak to value bet confidently. These hands often have the highest expected value when checked, even when you are the pre-flop raiser. Learning to genuinely value position on every single flop you play is the mindset shift that immediately and permanently improves your results. Before every session, remind yourself that in position is not just a preference. It is a different game entirely. Position is not one advantage among many. It is the advantage from which all other advantages flow. Play every hand in position differently than you play it out of position. Always. Before we go into the next section, which covers the most advanced and most profitable flop strategies in this video, I want to take a moment to talk to you directly as someone who is clearly serious about this game. If you have watched this far, you are not a casual player looking for tips. You are a student of poker looking for a system. And I want to make sure you know about something that has helped serious players at every level build exactly that. The Mind of a Grinder. Complete System is a collection of 10 advanced poker ebooks that were built from the ground up to give serious players a complete strategic framework for every major dimension of the game. Not generic advice, not tips you have heard before. A complete, structured, deeply practical system covering hand reading, GTO fundamentals, flop strategy including everything we are covering today, turn and river play, tournament strategy across all stack depths, cash game mastery, mental game architecture, bankroll management, opponent profiling, and advanced bluff construction. 10 books for $29.90. The link is in the description. I mention it here because if you are the player who wants to take everything in this video and go 10 levels deeper, that collection is the most efficient path to doing it. One investment, one system, everything you need to think and play at the highest level you are capable of reaching. Now, if this content is delivering real value to your game, hit the like button right now. Every like tells the algorithm this content is worth pushing to more serious players, and that is how this channel keeps producing material at this level. Subscribe if you have not already, because the next sections of this video contain some of the most practically valuable flop strategy content available on YouTube. And leave a comment below answering this question. What is the most expensive flop mistake you have made in a session? The answers are going to be interesting, and they will help everyone watching understand the patterns that cost players the most money on the first 3 community cards. Let us keep going. The combination of structured knowledge and consistent application is what actually moves the needle in poker results. Watching a video like this is the beginning. The ebooks take it to the level of deep, retained, applicable knowledge that changes how you play every hand. Every poker player who has made a meaningful leap in their results can point to a specific moment when they stopped relying on a collection of rules and started operating from a complete and coherent system. This video is designed to be that moment for you. The system is here. What you do with it next is entirely your decision. The player who invests in knowledge before investing in stakes will always outgrow the player who does it in reverse order. Exploiting your opponents on the flop is where abstract strategy becomes direct profit. And this is the section where we bridge everything we have covered into practical weapons you can deploy in your next session. The most important concept in exploitative flop play is this. Every player at your table has a tendency, a pattern, something they do too much of or not enough of that deviates from the theoretically optimal strategy. And every deviation from optimal is an opportunity to extract money with a targeted adjustment. The most common and most profitable deviation to exploit in live poker at every stake level below the very highest is overfolding to continuation bets on dry boards. Players who fold too frequently to C bets on boards like Ace Rainbow, King Low, or any disconnected texture are giving away their equity at a rate that compounds dramatically over a session. When you identify a player who folds to dry board C bets at an extremely high frequency, the correct response is not just to bet your strong hands for value. It is to expand your C-betting range to include a much wider variety of hands, including many hands that have very little actual equity, because the fold equity you generate from the opponent's tendency more than compensates for the times they call or raise. The second most profitable live poker exploitation on the flop is the reverse. Identifying players who call too much on wet boards and adjusting your C-betting frequency downward with marginal hands while betting more aggressively for value with your strongest holdings. Here is a hand example that illustrates exploitation precisely. You are playing in a live cash game. You have been at this table for 90 minutes, and you have noticed that one specific player, seated 2 seats to your right, folds to a very high percentage of C-bets when they call from the blinds. You raise from the cutoff with 7-4 of diamonds. Not a hand most players would think of as a C-betting candidate. The flop comes Ace of Hearts, 10 of Spades, 2 of Clubs. You C-bet. Your opponent folds. You did not have the ace. You did not have anything, but you had information about your opponent's pattern. And that information was worth more than your 2 whole cards in that specific situation. The most expensive opponents in poker are not the ones who bluff too much, or the ones who value bet too thin. They are the ones who have identified your leaks and are quietly extracting value from those leaks in every single hand they play against you without you even noticing. Exploiting opponents is not about being clever. It is about being observant. The most dangerous player at the table is not the most aggressive one. It is the one who has been watching you longest. Checking on the flop as a strategic choice, not as a reluctant concession, but as a deliberate and powerful move, is one of the most underused and most misunderstood tools in advanced flop play. Most recreational players check when they miss and bet when they hit. Most intermediate players have learned to C-bet as the pre-flop raiser and check as the caller, but the advanced player has unlocked a completely different relationship with the check, one that uses it as an information-gathering tool, a deception mechanism, a pot control device, and a range protection strategy all at the same time. Let us start with check as information. When you are out of position with a medium strength hand on a board where your opponent's range connects well, checking gives you the most valuable possible outcome sequence. If your opponent checks back, you receive a free card and preserve your equity in the pot, without risking additional chips with a hand that is not confident in its standing. If your opponent bets, their bet tells you something critical about the strength and composition of their range, Information you would not have if you had bet first. This is called checking with intention, and it is one of the marks of a player who thinks about every action as a source of information rather than just a declaration of hand strength. Now let us talk about check raise as an offensive weapon, because this is where checking becomes not just defensive but genuinely terrifying for opponents. A well-constructed check raise on the flop sends a specific and devastating message. It says that you were not simply passive on a board where you had a weak hand. It says that you had a hand strong enough to call and then raise, which represents a very specific and powerful part of your range. The check raise is particularly powerful on wet boards, where your range as the caller genuinely does have structural advantage, where your drawing hands and made hands mix in a way that makes your check raise range credible and difficult to counter. When you check raise as a pure bluff on a board where you have backdoor draws, you are applying pressure from a position of perceived strength while only committing chips at a favorable ratio. The check raise is the single most powerful and least used tool in the average poker player's arsenal. Learning to use it correctly, at the right frequencies, on the right board textures, against the right opponents, is one of the highest return skills you can develop in your next 50 hours of focused play. The check is not silence. It is a question. The player who uses it correctly forces their opponent to answer without realizing they are being interrogated. Hand reading from the flop is the skill that transforms all the technical knowledge we have covered into live, applicable, in-the-moment decision-making. You can understand range versus range theory perfectly in isolation. You can know every board texture category. You can have memorized C-bet frequencies and check-raise ranges. But if you cannot read what your specific opponent's specific action on the flop is telling you about their specific range in real time, none of that knowledge translates into better decisions under pressure. Hand reading is the bridge between theory and practice, and it begins on the flop. Here is how the professionals do it. They do not try to put their opponent on a single, specific hand. They maintain a range of possibilities and use each action to narrow that range, eliminating certain holdings and elevating the probability of others until the remaining range is specific enough to make a highly informed decision. Start with your pre-flop range read. Before the flop was dealt, your opponent's action already narrowed their range significantly. A call from the big blind against a cutoff raise is a different range than a call from the button against an under-the-gun raise. Same action, entirely different range composition, entirely different flop interaction. Now the flop hits. Your opponent faces your C-bet and calls. What does this call tell you? It eliminates most of their weakest hands, which would have folded. It reduces the likelihood of their strongest hands, which might have raised. It heavily suggests either a made hand of medium strength, a draw of some kind, or a floated hand with position or pot odds justification. Each subsequent action on the turn and river will narrow this range further, but the initial narrowing on the flop is where the most dramatic information is gathered because the range went from wide to medium in a single action. Here is a realistic high-stakes scenario. The board is Queen of Hearts, Jack of Clubs, Seven of Spades. You bet. Your opponent raises. What have they told you? They have almost certainly eliminated hands like Ace-High, King-High, most backdoor draws without made hand components. They have elevated the probability of made two pairs, sets, strong draws like King-10 or 10-9, with a flush draw component, or pure strong made hands. Your hand-reading process on the flop is not about magic or intuition. It is about systematic elimination and probability adjustment. Every action your opponent takes is a word in the sentence they are writing about their hand. The player who reads every word wins the conversation. Let us now build a complete flop strategy from pre-flop to flop decision using everything we have covered. Because theory without a complete hand example is instruction that stops short of the moment it becomes most useful. Picture this scenario. You are playing a mid-stakes cash game, six-handed, which means every position is more valuable and ranges are slightly wider than at a nine-handed game. You are on the button with ace of diamonds, nine of diamonds. A solid, experienced player opens from the hijack. You call on the button. The big blind also calls. Three ways to the flop. The flop comes ace of spades, six of clubs, three of hearts. The big blind checks. The hijack, the original raiser, fires a continuation bet of about 50% of the pot. Action is on you. Now let us apply every concept systematically. Range reading first. The hijack raised from a position that represents a moderately strong range. Their c-bet into 2 players on a coordinated range advantage board for an early position raiser suggests they have something, likely a hand with an ace or a pocket pair. But they are betting into 2 players, which also means they may be taking a stab with hands that benefit from fold equity. Your ace-9 is in a strong position here because you have top pair with a decent kicker, a backdoor flush draw in diamonds, and you are in position against both players. Board texture reading. Ace-6-3 rainbow is a relatively dry board. Low connectivity, no flush draw, limited straight draw possibilities. This board heavily favors the hijack's opening range, which contains many aces and strong holdings, but it also favors your calling range, which on the button includes many ace combinations. The big blind is likely struggling here with a range that does not connect well with top pair combinations. Position. You are last to act. You have the maximum information advantage. The big blind has checked. The hijack has bet. You have seen 2 actions before spending a chip. Your read says the hijack likely has a decent ace or is c-betting with a hand hoping for a fold. Given all of this, the call here is strong. You do not raise because the pot is 3 ways, and a raise bloats the pot in a spot where your kicker is not the strongest possible. You call with the intention of reassessing on the turn with full positional advantage. The complete hand framework we just walked through is not a checklist to run through slowly. It is a way of seeing that, practiced consistently, becomes automatic. The goal is to reach the point where this analysis happens faster than conscious thought, where you arrive at the correct decision before you are even fully aware of having analyzed the situation. The complete player does not make one decision on the flop. They build a plan across all 3 streets and execute it with the discipline to adjust when new information arrives. Here is what I want you to leave with from this video, because we have covered an enormous amount of strategic ground, and the most important thing is not which specific concept you remember most clearly. The most important thing is the shift in orientation. Most players who sit down at a poker table are playing a card game. They wait for good cards. They try to get paid when they hit. They fold when they miss. They are passengers in their own hands, being driven wherever the deck takes them. The players who dominate the flop, the players who consistently extract money from tables across every session at every stake level, are not passengers. They are architects. They arrive at the flop having already constructed a plan based on both ranges. They read the board texture and immediately understand who it favors and why. They select their betting and checking decisions not from habit, but from a specific framework that asks, what does this action accomplish given everything I know? They read their opponent's actions as information rather than just as events to react to. They know when to bet, when to check raise, and when to float. And they know when to do nothing. Because sometimes the highest expected value play on the flop is to take the most conservative line and wait for the turn to tell you what the hand actually is. That is flop mastery. Not aggression for its own sake. Not a simple rule about c-betting. A complete system for reading and responding to 3 community cards in a way that consistently generates better outcomes than the people sitting across from you. The 10 ebooks in the mind of a grinder. Complete system, available for $29.90 through the link in the description, go into every dimension of what we covered today at a level no single video can match. 10 books, 1 complete framework. The investment serious players make when they decide that improvement is not optional. And before you go, subscribe to this channel if you have not already, hit the like button to help this content reach more players who need it, and answer one question in the comments. What is the most expensive flop mistake you have made in the last month? The flop is where your results are really decided, and from this moment forward, you now know exactly why. Subscribe, like, and share this with a poker friend who is serious about getting better. The more serious players we build in this community, the higher the quality of every conversation about this game becomes. And higher quality conversations mean faster improvement for everyone. The cards you are dealt determine the situation. How you play the flop determines the outcome. Mastery of the first 3 community cards is mastery of the game itself.